Here is what nobody tells you about Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's own generals warned him it would lose the war. Every single one of them. And he ignored every single one of them. His generals showed him the numbers. The Soviet Union was 11 times the size of Germany. Its army was the largest on Earth. Its winters killed Napoleon. But Hitler had made up his mind. German intelligence told Hitler the Soviet army had 8,000 tanks. The real number was over 20,000. But here is what makes this even more extraordinary. Even with the wrong numbers, the general still begged him not to do it. And here is the part that still baffles historians. Stalin knew it was coming. His own spies told him. The British told him. Even some German officers warned him directly. He refused to believe any of them. Stalin had positioned his army so badly that when the attack came entire, Soviet armies would be surrounded and captured in the first week. 3 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner before summer ended. On the night of June 21st, 3 million German soldiers waited in complete silence along a front stretching 2,000 kilometers. They had been told nothing about where they were going or why, but they could feel it coming. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the silence ended, and the world changed forever. But before we show you what happened, remember this moment, because what Germany did not know in this darkness is what lost them the entire war. We will show you exactly what that was before this video ends. At 3:15 a.m., 7,000 artillery guns opened fire simultaneously along a 2,000-kilometer front. The noise was heard in Moscow 800 kilometers away. Soviet border guards radioed their commanders, "We are under attack." The response came back, "Do not fire. You must be mistaken." It lasted 4 minutes. Then the tanks arrived. 3 million soldiers, 3,500 tanks, 600,000 horses, moving forward simultaneously on a front wider than the entire distance from London to Moscow. Nothing in human history had ever looked like this. In the first 8 hours, Germany destroyed 1,800 Soviet aircraft. Most of them never left the ground. Stalin had refused to disperse them despite weeks of warning. Now they burned in neat rows exactly where they had been parked. German armor moved so fast that Soviet commanders lost track of where the front line was. Units were ordered to hold positions that Germans had passed through hours earlier. The entire Soviet command structure began to collapse before lunchtime on the first day. In Moscow, the reports arriving at military headquarters made no sense. The distances German forces had covered in hours were distances that should have taken days. Senior officers assumed the reports were wrong. They were not. By the end of the first day, Germany had advanced further into Soviet territory than military planners had thought possible in a week. But wait, it gets far worse. What happened in the next 6 days made the first day look like a warm-up. In German headquarters that evening, the mood was euphoric. The plan was working perfectly. The Soviet army appeared to be collapsing exactly as Hitler had predicted. What nobody in that room understood yet was that they were looking at exactly the wrong thing. Germany's strategy was not just to advance, it was to encircle. 2 armored columns would race past Soviet forces on both sides, then close the gap behind them, trapping entire armies in pockets with no way out. In the first week, Germany surrounded and captured 320,000 Soviet soldiers near Minsk alone. In 1 week, 1 pocket, 320,000 men. Soviet soldiers surrendered in numbers that overwhelmed German supply systems. Germany had not planned for prisoners on this scale because nobody had believed the collapse would happen this fast. Here is what nobody in German headquarters wanted to hear: the faster they advanced, the longer their supply lines became. And the longer the supply lines, the harder it became to feed 3 million men moving through a country the size of a continent. Soviet roads were not roads, they were dirt, tracks that turned to mud in the rain and dust in the heat. German supply trucks were not designed for them. The advance was outrunning its own food and fuel. By the end of the first week, German tank units were reporting that up to 30% of their vehicles needed mechanical repair. The tanks were breaking down faster than spare parts could reach them. After 1 week, Germany had advanced further and faster than any army in history. They had captured more prisoners than any campaign in history. And yet, looking east from the furthest German position, Russia stretched on for another 3,000 kilometers. They had barely started. A German officer wrote in his diary, "At the end of the first week, we keep advancing, and Russia keeps going. It never ends." I am starting to understand what Napoleon felt, and we have not even reached summer's end. Here is the thing Germany never counted on, and this is the part that actually lost them the war. Soviet factories were producing more tanks every single month than Germany destroyed in the entire first week of the invasion. Stalin had moved his factories east of the Ural Mountains completely beyond German reach. While Germany destroyed Soviet armies in the west, Soviet factories in the east were building new ones. Germany could not bomb them, could not reach them, could not stop them. Something else Germany had not counted on the Soviet army did not break. It bent, it lost entire armies, it lost territory the size of Western Europe, and it kept fighting. Every time Germany destroyed a Soviet unit, another appeared behind it. By mid-July, German commanders noticed something alarming. Soviet resistance was getting harder, not easier. Units that should have surrendered were fighting to the last man. Villages that should have been abandoned were defended house by house. German infantry found themselves fighting for every village, every tree line, every river crossing. The fast, clean advance of the first days was becoming a slow, grinding, attritional battle, exactly the kind of war Germany could not afford to fight. By the end of July, Germany had suffered over 200,000 casualties. The plan had assumed the Soviet army would collapse by August. Instead, every kilometer east cost more than the one before it. The supply crisis was now critical. German armored units were stopping not because of Soviet resistance, but because they had run out of fuel. Tanks sitting stationary in the middle of Russia waiting for petrol that was stuck on roads 300 kilometers behind them. And then Hitler made the decision that even his most loyal generals said was the final mistake. With Moscow in reach, he turned the Central Army Group south, away from Moscow, toward Ukraine. The arguments that followed in German headquarters were the most bitter of the entire war. In September, 6 weeks after turning south, Germany finally turned back toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, the final push. But 6 weeks had been lost, and in Russia, 6 weeks in autumn is the difference between victory and catastrophe. In October, Germany achieved the largest encirclement in military history, 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured in a single operation. The road to Moscow appeared completely open. Stalin began moving government files out of the city. In Moscow, panic set in. Citizens fled the city. Factories were evacuated. The secret police burned their files. Stalin himself packed his bags, then unpacked them. He decided to stay. That decision alone may have saved the Soviet Union. Then came the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Autumn rains turned every Russian road into a swamp overnight. German tanks sank to their hulls. Supply trucks disappeared entirely. The advance stopped not because of Soviet guns, but because of Russian mud. For weeks, the most powerful army in the world sat completely immobile in Russian mud, waiting for the ground to freeze. And when it finally froze, they wished it had stayed mud. November brought the Russian winter. -20, -30, -40 in some areas. German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms. Hitler had refused to issue winter clothing. He said it would damage morale by admitting the war had not been won in summer. German weapons froze. Tank engines would not start. Artillery mechanisms jammed solid. The most technologically advanced army in the world was being defeated not by Soviet soldiers, but by a temperature that German planners had refused to plan for. By early December, German forward units were 15 kilometers from Moscow. Some officers reported seeing the sun reflect off the golden domes of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They never got any closer. What happened next was the moment the war truly turned. On December 5th, the day before Pearl Harbor, the Soviet counterattack began. Fresh divisions from Siberia, men trained to fight at -40 degrees, men who had been waiting in the forests east of Moscow for exactly this moment. Soviet T-34 tanks had been designed for Russian winters, wide tracks, special lubricants, engines that started at -40. German tanks had none of these features. In the snow, the T-34 moved freely, while German armor sat frozen in place. German units that had advanced hundreds of kilometers in days were now retreating, abandoning tanks, guns, and equipment that had frozen solid and could not be moved. The army that had conquered Europe was running from the Russian winter. For the first time since 1939, a German army was being pushed back, not retreating by choice, being pushed back by force. The myth of German invincibility, the myth that had caused nation after nation to collapse without fighting, was broken in the snow outside Moscow. In German headquarters, the arguments became savage. Hitler dismissed his senior generals one after another, replacing them with officers who would tell him what he wanted to hear rather than what was actually happening. 12 senior commanders were removed in a single week. By January 1942, over 100,000 German soldiers had suffered frostbite serious enough to require amputation. Men lost fingers, toes, entire hands and feet, not to Soviet bullets but to temperatures their own commanders had refused to prepare them for. By February, the Soviet counterattack had exhausted itself, but Moscow had been saved. The 6-week war Hitler had promised his generals had become a grinding attritional nightmare with no end visible. And Germany was now fighting exactly the war it could not win. A German soldier wrote home in February 1942, "They told us it would be over by Christmas. It is February. We are in holes in the ground in Russia. I do not think anyone is coming to get us." Remember that open loop from the beginning of this video? This right here is what Germany did not know in the darkness of June 22nd. Russia does not lose at home. It never has. It never will. In summer 1942, Germany launched another massive offensive, this time toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The army was smaller, more tired, and facing a Soviet force that had learned from a year of catastrophic defeat exactly how to fight back. Then came Stalingrad, a city Hitler decided must be taken because it bore Stalin's name. What followed was the deadliest battle in human history, 2 million casualties in 5 months. And Germany lost. At Stalingrad, Germany lost an entire army, 300,000 men, gone. The German public was told for the first time that the war was not going as planned. People who had celebrated the invasion of Russia in June 1941 wept in the streets of German cities in February 1943. At Kursk in July 1943, Germany launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front. It failed within days. From that moment, Germany never attacked again in the East. It only retreated for 2 more years, all the way back to Berlin. The Soviet army that faced Germany in 1944 was not the army of June 1941. 3 years of catastrophic defeat had produced the most battle-hardened military force in history, and it was coming west all the way to Berlin. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin. The city that had sent 3 million men to conquer Russia was itself being conquered by Russia. The war that Hitler's generals had begged him not to start ended exactly where they had told him it would end. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war that Operation Barbarossa was supposed to win in 6 weeks had lasted 4 years and killed 27 million Soviet people. Hitler's generals had been right about everything, and he had listened to none of them. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in 4 years, more than any other nation in any war in human history. And it won. The country that Germany said would collapse in 6 weeks outlasted the German Empire by 46 years. In Russia today, the war is called the Great Patriotic War, not World War II. Every family lost someone. There is not a village, town, or city in Russia that does not have a memorial to the dead. The wound has never fully healed. Historians who have studied the original Barbarossa planning documents say the same thing. The plan was based not on what Russia actually was, but on what Germany needed Russia to be. It was a plan built on wishful thinking, and 27 million people paid for that wishful thinking with their lives. The Eastern Front was the largest and most destructive military campaign in human history. More people died there than in all other theaters of WW2 combined. The world we live in today, its borders, its politics, its fears were all shaped by what happened on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945. At the Brest Fortress, one of the first places attacked on June 22nd, Soviet defenders held out for nearly a month after the front had moved hundreds of kilometers east. Surrounded, cut off, with no food or water, they kept fighting. Scratched into the walls of the fortress are their final messages. One reads, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." Operation Barbarossa was the invasion that lost Hitler the war. His generals knew it, history proved it, and 27 million people who never wanted any part of it paid the price. The lesson, written in the largest letters history has ever used, is one the world has still not fully learned.